Hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Sloat. I'm a resident of Ready Lake and former Boy Scout with Troop 300 out of Lake City. As an adult, I'm blessed to have the opportunity to live and raise my kids on Ready Lake, the same lake that I learned how to swim on as a boy while attending summer camp at Camp Gorec. The outdoor education I received across the water here has helped to shape my life in so many ways. Like so many other residents of the Forest Lakes, I wholeheartedly support Gorec's mission of outdoor access, education, and recreation. And if that's all they were asking for, I'd be standing right there alongside them. The PUD application that you now have before you does not carry out Gorec's mission in a way that is respectful to our lakes, environment, residents, or our local laws. And instead, it seeks permission in perpetuity to break our laws and allow for a busy event center in a location where that kind of scale and intensity is completely inappropriate. Individual property rights matter a great deal, and fortunately, we have carefully thought out laws in place to mitigate when the interests of property owners conflict. Sometimes these laws deserve consideration for exception, like when those exceptions are self-contained and won't have adverse effects on neighbors. And sometimes they don't, when they aren't contained, inconsistent with the intent of the ordinance, incompatible with adjacent uses, and when they will have adverse effects on neighbors. This distinction is essential in your deliberation. I'd like to take just a few minutes of your time to talk about these laws and the outsized, irreversible impacts of Gorec's plans should they be approved. Let's take a look at what Gorec is asking for permission to do beyond opening the trails and offering classes. If approved, this application would allow for 20 large-sized special events with up to 420 guests each, including 12 summer weddings, each with up to 300 guests. 50 additional mid-sized year-round events with up to 100 guests. Events of over 420, like large races with transient activity permits, compounded by the operation of a full campground hosting over 300 guests, with commercial vendor traffic and the shuttles, buses, and trolleys needed to transport these many thousands of guests around, and 60 boats launching on Ready Lake at any given time. To put these numbers into perspective, on any given day, you're talking about nearly doubling the entire population of Ready Lake, increasing its boat traffic 500%, and overwhelming its surrounding, hilly, poor line-of-sight secondary roads, adding over 2,000 extra vehicle trips per day on Hobbs Highway alone. 70 large and mid-sized events per year, weddings every other weekend all summer long, in the intensity of over 700 people on the property at a time. Alright, so that's the ask. So what exactly is a PUD, and why is it being used for this?
According to the zoning ordinance, the purpose of the PUD is to permit flexibility in the regulation of land development and to encourage innovation and variety in land use and design of projects of sufficient size. It shall not have any adverse economic, social, or environmental impacts on surrounding land uses. So I just wanted to kind of highlight tonight that a PUD is certainly not a blank check to break zoning rules.
So you heard Claire, not a blank check, but zoning flexibility with constraints. This can be a useful tool under the right circumstances. PUDs give the township flexibility and regulation that allows for innovation in land use in a manner that's self-contained and doesn't adversely affect surrounding uses. Why not allow for exceptions to the rules for one landowner or developer when those exceptions aren't going to hurt anyone else? So what do our laws specifically say about these flexibility constraints? The application statement of intent comes from Section 636 of the ordinance. It states that projects must both be sufficient in size to be self-contained and will not have any adverse economic, social, or environmental impact on surrounding land uses. Section 602 covers special land use review standards. And note that PUDs are a type of special land use. This section states that approved uses and activities shall be consistent with and promote the intent and purpose of this zoning ordinance and shall be compatible with adjacent uses of land and the natural environment. Approval of applications is also subject to 8 specific standards defined in Section 602. The ordinance says the Planning Commission shall approve such special land use only if it finds that such special land use meets each of these standards. Note that language says the township can approve only if and meets each for these standards. And why? Section 600 on special land uses says, due to the nature of the special use, special land uses require special consideration in relation to the welfare of adjacent properties. Notice the pattern in these criteria and word choices? only if, meets each, any adverse effect, shall be compatible, shall be consistent. The ordinance doesn't say maybe, some, and optionally. There are no exceptions to these intents, standards, and requirements. This is out of the consideration for the welfare of adjacent properties. Section 601 covers specific standards and requirements for special land uses. And it says this about the basis for action. If the facts regarding the special land use do not establish by a preponderance of the evidence that these standards and requirements can and will be met by the proposed use, the township shall deny the application. You are tasked with determining if this application and the changes in use Gorec seeks are consistent with the intent of PUD applications, are self-contained, don't have any adverse effects, are compatible with adjacent uses, consistent with the ordinance, and with all standards and requirements set forth within. If this cannot be established by a preponderance of the evidence, our ordinance requires you to deny this application. This is a very high bar. Now let's talk about self-containment and adverse effects because they go hand in hand. Protecting neighbors from adverse effects that could result from PUDs is so important that it is spelled out in the application's statement of intent, which clearly says that approved projects will not have any adverse economic, social, or environmental impact on surrounding land uses. Any. That is precisely zero allowable economic, social, or environmental impact. This leaves no room for exception and comes with the explicit understanding that these flexibilities in regulation are isolated to the property and will have zero negative impact on neighbors. Our inland lakes are being devastated by the irreversible impacts of aquatic invasive species. Once lakes are infected, they can become unusable to all, and the 6 to 7 figure costs of simply mitigating the damage end up the responsibility of the riparians. Rennie is the top 10% of lakes in terms of water quality. This is largely because the only boats that touch it don't go anywhere else. 60 boats launching on any given day will change this rapidly. The proposed boat wash station is inadequate to resolve this adverse effect. Established boat wash stations run by trained technicians at public boat launches can only slow the spread of but not stop AIS. The DNR recommendation, after a boat has been cleaned and dried, is to dry the boat and trailer for 5 days in the sun prior to use, and only then can you hope to mitigate the spread. The proposed public boat traffic will simply overwhelm this small lake, creating boater safety issues and denying reasonable riparian access. Rennie Lake is a 230-acre lake where you will never find more than 30 boats on the busiest day of the year and closer to 10 or fewer on any day that's not the 4th of July. The obvious math shows that Gorec is proposing to increase boat traffic by 500%. Using metrics and formulas from every publicly available carrying capacity study, you arrive at no more than 21 non-motorized craft total before Rennie Lake would be considered excessively overcrowded and high on the conflict scale. Many riparians would consider this to be an adverse effect. The proposed activity of an event center on top of a large campground will bring an abundance of extra traffic to it and on winding, hilly, poor line of sight secondary roads. My kids will have to learn how to drive on these roads. Many of us can't get to town without driving past Hobbs Highway. They will not only be driving on roads with exceptionally more traffic, but they will be driving on roads with a much higher percentage of intoxicated drivers leaving events and feeling invincible on our country roads. This application is a reckless disregard of our safety. The cost is an unacceptable adverse effect. Intense human activity in the form of noise, smoke, and boating will displace wildlife like our threatened loons that return to nest annually in the peace and quiet of Little Rennie. Losing these precious neighbors will surely be an adverse effect. I could do an entire video just on environmental impact, but just something you should keep in mind about the firm we're relying on for the facts about the environmental assessment.
Wade Trim is not an environmental review firm.
The most intense commercial activity is not interior to the site as the application review claims. The main venue sits atop a hill, unbuffered from the shoreline that sits just 150 feet away. Up to 70 times a year, in at least 12 of the best weekends of the year, loud music will emanate from weddings, events, and other gatherings that involve amplified music, drinking, and festive behavior. This sound will travel unabated across the water to nearby neighbors and beyond. The township engineer requested that the Rotary hire a sound engineer to determine if this would be a problem. So instead, they hired a party equipment rental company.
Is that from Sound Environments?
Sound Environments, yep.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's the same.
Yep.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
the engineer that provided that.
Beyond being a conflict of interest, none of the people hired are credentialed to provide this type of assessment. Anyone who's ever sat on a lake shore at night and heard someone talking in a fishing boat 3/4 of the way across the lake knows more about the science of how sound travels over the water than this stereo equipment rental guy. He claims to have tested the ambient sound level to establish a noise baseline, but his readings are 10 to 15 decibels higher than anything we've recorded during the day and 30 decibels higher than evening readings. For perspective, a 10 decibel increase equates to a doubling in perceived volume. This means his baseline is 2 to 8 times too high in terms of baseline volume he's assuming is there to offset the chicken dance. Since the party rental guy didn't do a test, we thought we should. And hey, we're just as credentialed. So we got our hands on a DJ grade system capable of pumping out tunes at 95 to 100 decibels, comparable with the level most DJs play at. We set this system up in the evening at a property very close to the camp at a similar elevation. We then played the same 3 song segments and observed from 4 locations on the lake. At the nearest neighbors on Autumn Trail, it sounded like you were at the party. 0.8 of a mile across the water on the shore of Woods and Waters, you could hear every lyric and every thump. Someone in the same home 0.8 of a mile away with windows closed could hear the music with headphones on. Another neighbor on Cants Road told me he could hear it in his house, windows closed over his TV. Pretty sure they'd both consider this to be an adverse effect. So we've clearly established this isn't self-contained, and there are an abundance of adverse effects. What about consistency with the ordinance and compatibility with adjacent uses? What does it mean to be consistent with and promote the intent of the zoning ordinance? What does it mean to say the new land uses are compatible with adjacent uses of the land? Section 231 of the zoning ordinance defines our forest lakes district. The inland lakes are the defining characteristic, and their protection is the key goal you're responsible for. Expanding nonconformity to allow a busy public boat launch and the introduction of aquatic invasive species is the opposite of protecting this defining and valuable asset for current and future generations. A busy event center will do nothing to continue the ordinance-defined rural character of the community. The ordinance also states that the intent of the encompassing lakes area district is intended to establish and maintain a low-intensity residential and recreational environment. And what about the surrounding uses for the compatibility test? Well, you have the mentioned low-density residential, a lot of state forest, and of course, neighboring Brownbridge quiet area. 300-person weddings, 420-person events, and corporate retreats stacked on top of a 300-person campground is not low intensity. How can 70 high-intensity events, the many thousands of guests they will bring, and the supporting commercial activity be compatible with the expressed low-intensity rural character of the community that's reflected in compatible adjacent uses and that our ordinance guarantees? So that's the present. What about the township's future plans for this area? When comparing the current zoning map to the future land use map, you see that we go from lakes area in the current zoning to natural area preservation and very low density on the future land use map, with Gorec being mainly in the natural area preservation. According to the township, future land use guides zoning designations and broad policy decisions. The purpose of the Natural Area Preservation District is to preserve large tracts of land offering important wetlands, wildlife habitat, forest lands, and river valleys with as little disturbance as possible. Is a massive event center, a public boat launch, 64 campfires, and a busy campground as little disturbance as possible as it pertains to our wildlife, wetlands, and forest lands? We're not people who moved in next to an airport and then started complaining about the noise from airplanes. Our ordinance says that something like this should never be possible. Approval would be a violation of the township's fundamental contract with its citizens. If the uses Gorec is requesting were compatible and consistent, then they would be allowed in this district, but they're not. So you have to ask yourself why, and why this applicant deserves an exception, and if there's a preponderance of evidence supporting their case. The application also loudly fails at 6 of 8 special land use review standards, for many of the same reasons we've discussed in other sections. It would be unreasonable to come to the conclusions you see stated in the report around things like a busy event center being, quote, some limited additional use, and that, quote, commercial use is interior to the site when the main event facility is on the water, and that there's no construction when agency conditions demand it. I could go on. This process is flawed, and the facts do not support the recommendation. PUDs allow the township flexibility, but they are not blank checks, and their allowance cannot come at the cost of surrounding use. They have ordinance-specified intents, standards, and requirements. Approval of PUDs requires a preponderance of evidence that the standards and requirements can and will be met by the proposed use. This application fails to meet the required standards and must be denied by the board. and they don't fit cleanly into the bounds of a PUD conversation, but I did want to leave you with a few other thoughts worth considering. First, this is not how the property has always been used. Beyond being plainly ridiculous in comparison to the asks of the PUD, the claims around consistency with historic usage of the former Boy Scout camp have been repeatedly refuted by the township attorney in a memo to the township, by a letter from the former zoning administrator, by former camp staff, and by local Scout historians. Second, Gorec is the Rotary is Gorec. Do we really have to believe that one wedding has to be held to keep the trails open since
Rotary Club of Traverse City, the richest Rotary Club in the world?
the Rotary has collected more than $100 million in profits from the oil and gas wells on the same property, has $46 million in reserves, and nets $500,000 annually? When a charitable organization has access to that kind of capital, it's a choice as to when to be a charity and when to be a business. Third, equal application of the law. The Raymond Farms wedding venue was just rejected by the Planning Commission. They were only asking for 12 events with 200 people and no amplified music. Listen to some of the concerns expressed.
But a special land use is, it may or may not fit in a certain location. And it's up to us to kind of have this conversation.
My concern right now was going from originally like 4 events to now 12, and I'll leave it at that at this point.
In a rural area, I just wouldn't want to see the impacts go from 0 events today to maybe a dozen across the course of an entire summer.
And when you have events like this at 300, that's a lot of people. Even if you're not having amplified noise, even if we were to just have 300 people in a room and they're talking, it can get pretty loud. Now, add in things of a festive nature where people are drinking and having a good time, that noise gets a little bit louder. If they're in a barn, that's great when it's cool weather out, but it's not air conditioned, so all of a sudden doors are open, it gets a little bit louder. We have porta-john facilities that are located outside, so now you have a lot of that activity. I don't think it's necessarily going to be always contained. Just think the scale of it is something I don't think is appropriate in this.
These were all comments made about Raymond Farm. The only difference here is that the barn becomes Besser, the noise projects unabated across the lake, it's all compounded with a large on-site campground, and there are more events with more people. And lastly, we realize that we're a smaller group of homeowners. We don't have the same kind of pull as the Rotary, but that's exactly why we're depending on you all to do the right thing. Put yourselves in our shoes and ask how you would feel if this were happening next door to you, on the lake where you raise your kids and eventually plan to peacefully spend your retirement years. There's no magical undo button for the wrong decision here. We can't erase the permanent damage, but you can prevent it before it's too late.